You hear that? The question drifted across the loading yard so quietly that at first nobody even realized the old man had spoken. The steady growl of diesel engines rolled through Fort Ridgeline as forklifts carried pallet after pallet of live ammunition beneath the pale Texas morning sun. Soldiers in reflective vests moved between olive-drab transport trucks with clipboards and handheld scanners while the smell of hot asphalt and machine oil hung thick in the dry air. Near the far edge of the ammo yard, beside a stack of weathered shipping crates stamped with yellow hazard markings, 83-year-old Walter Kane stood perfectly still with his head slightly tilted, listening to something nobody else could hear. Specialist Ryan Mercer noticed him immediately and let out a sharp laugh. "You hearing ghosts over there, Grandpa?" A few soldiers nearby chuckled without looking up from their work. Mercer walked toward him with the swagger of a young man who trusted rank, technology, and procedure more than instinct. At 24 years old, he was already known across the base as the smartest ammunition specialist in the battalion. His uniform was crisp despite the heat, his sleeves rolled with perfect precision, his tablet tucked confidently beneath one arm. Walter didn't answer right away. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the nearest crate as another forklift rumbled past, the vibration shivering faintly through the concrete beneath their boots. Then it came again. Tick. 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 Almost too soft to notice beneath the engines. Walter's expression tightened just slightly. Mercer smirked when he saw it. "What is it now? You think the ammo's haunted?" More laughter rose from the loading crew. One private shook his head and muttered, "Man probably thinks we're still in Vietnam." Walter finally looked at Mercer. His face was lined deeply from decades of desert wind, sun glare, and old memories that never completely faded. He wore a faded olive field jacket that looked older than most of the men standing there. The cuffs were frayed. One sleeve carried a small burn mark near the wrist. "That crate shouldn't move," Walter said quietly. Mercer stared at him for a second before snorting. "According to who?" He lifted the tablet in his hand. "Every thermal scan is green. Pressure seals are good. Inventory cleared inspection 2 hours ago." Walter glanced back toward the pallet. 12 soldiers were preparing to escort those rounds out to a live fire training range 40 miles north of the base. Young men laughing beside trucks they trusted. Men who had no idea they were standing beside something unstable. The forklift operator revved the engine again. Tick. 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 Walter heard the faint metallic rhythm buried beneath the vibration. Not random. Not mechanical. Pressure cycling inside heated metal. The sound crawled across the back of his neck like cold rain. Mercer folded his arms. "You know what your problem is, old man? Guys like you think instincts beat systems. They don't anymore." Walter said nothing. The wind pushed across the yard carrying dust and heat waves between the parked convoy trucks. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed low over the base with a dull rhythmic thump that echoed off the hangars. Nobody noticed Walter's eyes narrowing toward the crate again. Nobody noticed his breathing slow almost imperceptibly. But Sergeant Noah Ellis noticed. Standing beside the manifest table, Ellis watched the old veteran carefully. Iraq had taught him something important years ago. Truly dangerous men rarely raised their voices. Walter Kane looked exactly like the kind of man who had survived things nobody wanted to remember. Mercer pointed toward the access gate. "Look, unless those boxes scare you personally, you need to move along. This is an active military loading zone." Walter kept staring at the crate. Tick. 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 Then he spoke in the same calm voice. "That sound means the metal's heating from the inside." The laughter stopped for just a second. Only for a second. Then Mercer shook his head with a grin. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "We got ourselves a fortune teller." The smile slowly faded from Specialist Mercer's face when Walter Kane stepped closer to the pallet instead of backing away. Heat shimmer rolled above the concrete yard while the forklift idled beside the stack of ammunition. Crates, its engine rattling low like distant thunder. Around them, the loading crew kept moving, boots scraping asphalt, radios crackling, diesel fumes hanging heavy in the dry morning air. But Walter seemed detached from all of it. His attention stayed locked on the metal container as though the rest of the base no longer existed. Mercer shook his head with exaggerated disbelief and turned toward the nearby soldiers. "This is exactly why civilians should stay outside restricted areas," he announced loudly enough for the entire crew to hear. "Guy hears one weird sound and suddenly we are all supposed to panic." A few men laughed again, though not as confidently as before. Walter ignored them. Slowly, deliberately, he placed one weathered hand against the side of the crate. The steel surface looked normal beneath the yellow warning stencils and faded serial numbers. But his fingers remained there longer than anyone expected. Sergeant Noah Ellis watched carefully from beside the convoy manifest table. He noticed something strange immediately. Walter was not simply touching the crate. He was feeling for rhythm. Tiny pulses. Minute vibrations hidden beneath the metal skin. The kind of thing nobody without decades around explosives would ever think to notice. Mercer stepped closer, irritation hardening his voice. "You done putting on the magic trick?" Walter did not look at him. "How long has this pallet been sitting in direct sun?" Mercer scoffed. "Long enough for you to start hallucinating apparently." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Answer the question." The edge in the old man's voice surprised everyone nearby. It was calm, but heavy. The kind of voice that had once given orders people obeyed immediately. Mercer folded his arms tighter across his chest. 3 hours. Maybe 4. Why? Walter slowly removed his hand from the crate. Because the internal pressure is climbing. One of the younger privates exchanged an uneasy glance with another soldier. Mercer caught it instantly and snapped, "Do not start with this nonsense." He pointed at the thermal scanner clipped to his vest. "We already checked every crate twice. No heat spikes. No damaged seals. No instability warnings." Walter looked toward the scanner for a long moment before speaking again. "Machines read surfaces. War teaches you to hear what is underneath." The sentence settled strangely across the yard. Even the forklift operator stopped grinning. Mercer let out a short laugh, but this time it sounded forced. "You know what I think," he said. "I think you miss being important." Walter finally turned his head toward him. The old veteran's pale eyes looked almost colorless beneath the harsh Texas sunlight. "Son," he said quietly, "I spent 40 years trying not to remember this sound." A gust of hot wind swept dust across the concrete between them. Somewhere farther down the yard, a cargo ramp slammed shut with a metallic boom that made several soldiers flinch. Walter did not move at all. Tick. 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 The faint rhythm came again from somewhere deep inside the crate. Barely audible. Almost hidden beneath the rumble of engines and generators. But now Sergeant Ellis heard it too. His stomach tightened immediately. Not because he understood what it meant, but because of the way Walter reacted to it. The old man's expression changed for only half a second. A flicker. A memory passing behind tired eyes. Ellis had seen combat veterans make that exact face before. It was never random. Mercer noticed Ellis staring and rolled his eyes. "Do not tell me you are buying this." Ellis hesitated. "I am saying maybe we should pause the convoy until EOD checks the pallet." Mercer barked out a laugh sharp enough to cut through the yard noise. "For what? Ghost sounds?" He gestured toward the waiting trucks lined beside the ammo depot. 12 soldiers were already climbing into vehicles preparing for departure to the live-fire range north of the base. Engines rumbled impatiently beneath the growing heat. Mercer pointed toward the convoy with open frustration. You want me to delay an entire battalion exercise because an old man touched a box and got nervous? Walter looked back at the crate one more time. Tick. 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 Then he spoke so softly that only Ellis heard him clearly. It is getting faster. The heat over Fort Ridgeline kept rising as the convoy countdown. Clock mounted beside the loading bay dropped under 14 minutes. Sunlight blazed across the concrete hard enough to distort the air above the parked trucks in shimmering waves. Soldiers moved faster now, boots thudding against metal ramps while forklifts carried ammunition pallets toward the convoy line one after another. But around Walter Kane's crate, the atmosphere had changed. The laughter was gone. Not completely replaced by fear yet, but by something quieter. Unease. Specialist Ryan Mercer noticed it immediately, and it irritated him more than the old man ever could. He stepped forward until he stood almost chest to chest with Walter. "You are holding up military operations," Mercer said sharply. "Either explain exactly what you think is happening, or leave the yard." Walter's eyes remained on the pallet. Tick. 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 Faster now. Barely noticeable beneath the grinding diesel engines, but steady. Wrong. He could feel the rhythm through the soles of his boots. "Internal pressure instability," Walter said calmly. "Probably heat expansion inside damaged propellant casings." Mercer threw both hands into the air dramatically. "Probably," he repeated loudly. "That is your expert diagnosis." Several nearby soldiers glanced toward each other nervously. Mercer saw it and pushed harder. "You know how many checks this shipment passed before sunrise?" He held up his tablet again like a shield. "Digital inspection. Thermal imaging. Seal verification. Moisture analysis. Everything cleared regulation." Walter finally looked at him. "Then your regulations missed something." The sentence landed like a hammer against steel. Mercer's face hardened instantly. Around them, forklifts continued weaving between trucks, but more eyes were drifting toward the confrontation now. Sergeant Noah Ellis slowly walked closer from the manifest table, pretending to review paperwork while he listened. Mercer laughed again, but there was frustration inside it now. "You know what your problem is, old-timer? You think instinct matters more than systems because systems replaced guys like you." Walter did not react outwardly. A warm gust of wind swept across the ammo yard carrying the smell of heated rubber and diesel exhaust. Somewhere overhead, a pair of fighter jets roared faintly across the distant sky. Walter's expression stayed fixed, distant, almost detached from the noise around him. "Systems fail," he said quietly. "Metal does not lie." Mercer shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane." He pointed toward the convoy. 12 soldiers were climbing into armored transport trucks while another team secured the final pallets for departure. Young faces. Relaxed faces. Men expecting another routine range exercise beneath the Texas sun. "You are standing here trying to scare people because you heard a sound." Walter looked back toward the crate again. Tick. 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 "No," he said softly. "I am standing here because I heard that sound once before." The air seemed to tighten around the words. Mercer opened his mouth to answer, but Walter had already stepped closer to the pallet again. Slowly, the old veteran crouched beside the lower corner of the crate. His weathered fingers brushed lightly across one of the steel bands securing the ammunition containers together. Then his hand stopped. One section of metal felt warmer than the rest. Not enough for a scanner warning. Not enough for a machine to flag immediately. But enough for him. Walter closed his eyes briefly. For just a second, the hot Texas wind vanished. He smelled jungle moisture instead. Burned wiring. Heated brass. Rain steaming against steel under a black night sky. The memory hit him like distant thunder rolling across decades. Tick. 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 The same rhythm. The same hidden pressure building beneath silence. Sergeant Ellis noticed Walter's hand tighten slightly against the crate and felt a knot twist in his own stomach. Combat veterans recognized fear differently than civilians did. Real fear was quiet. Real fear stood perfectly still. Mercer took a step forward, losing patience entirely. "That is enough," he snapped. "You are done interfering with this operation." He pointed toward the gate at the far end of the yard. "Either walk out yourself or I call security." Walter slowly rose to his feet again. His pale eyes drifted toward the convoy trucks lined beneath the blazing morning sun. 12 soldiers. Less than 14 minutes until departure. Then he looked back at Mercer and spoke in a voice so calm it almost made the words worse. "If those trucks leave this yard," he said, "somebody is not coming home." For a moment, nobody in the loading yard moved. The words hung in the dry Texas air heavier than the heat itself. Somewhere beyond the convoy line, a diesel engine revved loudly before settling back into a low mechanical growl, but around Walter Kane and the ammunition pallet, the atmosphere had gone strangely still. Specialist Ryan Mercer stared at the old veteran in open disbelief. Then his expression hardened into irritation. "You do not get to walk in here and start predicting funerals," he snapped. Walter did not answer. His attention shifted downward instead. Near the base of the crate, wedged partly beneath one of the steel braces, something small had rolled loose during loading. A single artillery round casing. Not live. Just an empty calibration shell used during inspection. Walter bent slowly and picked it up with one weathered hand. The metal looked dull beneath the sunlight, scratched from years of handling. But the instant his fingers closed around it, the world around him changed. The heat of Fort Ridgeline disappeared beneath another kind of heat entirely. Wet heat. Jungle heat. The bright Texas sky dissolved into darkness split by sheets of monsoon rain. Walter was 19 again, standing ankle-deep in red mud beside an ammunition pit outside Da Nang. The air smelled of diesel fuel, soaked canvas, and overheated steel. Young soldiers moved through the darkness carrying shells beneath swinging floodlights while thunder rolled low across distant hills. Then came the sound. Tick. 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 Quiet at first. Hidden beneath generators and rain. Almost impossible to hear unless you already knew what it meant. Walter remembered turning toward the stacked rounds near the center of the pit. He remembered the heat rolling off the metal despite the storm. One of the older sergeants had laughed when Walter tried warning him. "You are hearing ghosts, Kane." The words echoed across decades so clearly it almost hurt. Then the smell changed. Sharp. Bitter. Heated propellant. Walter remembered the feeling that followed more than anything else. Not panic. Certainty. The terrible certainty that something irreversible had already started. The memory slammed into him so vividly that his breathing slowed. Around him now, the loading yard at Fort Ridgeline blurred for half a heartbeat beneath ghosts of rain and jungle darkness. Sergeant Noah Ellis watched Walter carefully and noticed the old man's grip tightening around the empty casing. His face had gone pale beneath the sun. Mercer noticed it too and shook his head dismissively. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "You are seriously trying to scare my entire crew with some more story?" Walter looked up slowly, but his eyes no longer seemed focused on the convoy. They looked fixed somewhere decades away. "The first man who ignored that sound died believing the system checked everything," Walter said quietly. The wind swept across the loading yard again, carrying dust between the parked trucks. Nearby soldiers had stopped pretending not to listen now. Even the forklift operator remained seated motionless inside the cab, watching the old veteran with growing uncertainty. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice sharply. "Enough." He pointed toward the gate again. "You are done here." Walter glanced toward the convoy clock mounted beside the depot wall. 11 minutes until departure. Tick. 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 Faster now. Mercer could not hear it. Most of the crew still could not hear it. But Ellis heard it clearly now beneath the engines. Tiny metallic pulses hidden inside heated steel. His stomach tightened hard. Walter slowly handed the empty casing toward Mercer. "Feel it," he said. Mercer rolled his eyes but snatched the casing anyway. "Happy now?" Walter's voice remained calm. "No," Mercer frowned slightly as the metal touched his palm. It felt warmer than it should have under open air. Not hot enough to alarm him immediately. Just wrong enough to linger. Before he could say anything, another sound drifted softly from inside the pallet. Tick. 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 This time Mercer heard it too. The sound seemed louder now that Mercer had finally heard it himself. Not loud in volume. Loud in meaning. Tiny metallic clicks hidden deep inside the crate like something alive shifting beneath layers of steel and heat. Specialist Ryan Mercer stared down at the empty casing in his hand, his confidence flickering for the first time all morning. Around him, the loading yard continued moving, but slower now. More uncertain. Soldiers near the convoy had begun glancing toward the pallet every few seconds without realizing they were doing it. Walter Kane watched Mercer carefully. He had seen this exact moment before. The moment doubt first entered a young soldier's mind. It always looked the same. The slight tightening around the eyes. The hesitation before speaking. The instinct trying to outrun pride. Mercer handed the casing back sharply, as if annoyed the metal still felt warm against his skin. "Could be expansion from surface heat," he muttered. The explanation sounded rehearsed even to him. Walter slipped the casing into his jacket pocket. "Not like that." Tick. 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 Faster now. Sergeant Noah Ellis looked toward the convoy clock again. 9 minutes until departure. The dry Texas wind swept across the loading yard carrying dust and exhaust fumes between the parked trucks. One of the younger privates near the forklift shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should stop loading until EOD checks it," he said quietly. Mercer turned on him immediately. Nobody asked for commentary. The private went silent at once. But the damage was already done. The crew was nervous now. Walter could feel it spreading through the yard the same way heat spreads through steel. Invisible at first. Then impossible to ignore. Mercer pulled his radio from his vest and keyed the channel with visible frustration. "Control, this is Specialist Mercer at Loading Zone 3. Requesting confirmation on thermal scan logs for pallet Delta 7. Static crackled briefly before a voice answered. "All scans normal. No irregularities reported." Mercer looked back at Walter with renewed confidence. "There. Happy?" Walter's expression did not change. The shell casing was already venting when they scanned it. Mercer frowned. "That is not possible." Walter slowly looked toward the crate again. Metal expands before systems notice. Ellis felt another knot tighten in his stomach. The old veteran was not guessing anymore. He was remembering. There was a difference. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You keep talking like you know exactly what is inside that pallet." Walter answered without hesitation. "I know what overheated propellant sounds like when pressure starts building unevenly." The words settled heavily between them. Nearby soldiers had stopped working entirely now. Even the forklift engine idled untouched. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was listening for the sound now. Tick. 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 Mercer heard it again and this time his jaw tightened visibly. Tiny. Rhythmic. Wrong. Sweat rolled down the side of his neck despite the dry air. "You are telling me 30 artillery rounds are unstable because of a sound?" Walter looked directly at him. "No," his voice stayed low and calm. I am telling you 30 rounds are unstable because I smelled the propellant venting before you even noticed the crate. Mercer blinked. What? Walter's eyes drifted toward the steel bands wrapped around the pallet. The odor changes when the casing pressure starts climbing. Burnt chemicals. Hot brass. Sweet at first. Then bitter. Ellis suddenly realized Walter had been breathing through his nose every few seconds since arriving at the yard. Not nervous breathing. Tracking. Like an old hunting dog following smoke through wind. Mercer glanced toward the crate again. His confidence was fading faster now, though pride still fought to hold the line. You cannot identify unstable ammunition by smell. Walter looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Son, he said quietly, I buried friends because one lieutenant trusted paperwork more than heat. The convoy clock dropped under 8 minutes. Somewhere overhead, another helicopter passed low above the base. Its rotor wash stirred dust across the loading yard in hot swirling sheets. Then the metallic ticking inside the crate suddenly sped up again. Tick tick tick. Even Mercer froze this time. The ticking inside the crate had become impossible to ignore now. Not loud enough to dominate the yard, but sharp enough to cut through every other sound once a person noticed it. Tick tick tick. Tiny metallic pulses buried beneath heated steel. The loading crew stood frozen beside the convoy trucks, eyes drifting nervously between Walter Kane and the pallet nobody wanted to touch anymore. Dust rolled low across the concrete as the Texas wind swept through the yard carrying the smell of diesel fuel and sunbaked metal. Sergeant Noah Ellis slowly stepped closer to the crate while Specialist Ryan Mercer remained planted in place beside the forklift, jaw tight with frustration. Mercer still wanted to believe this was nothing. Systems did not fail. Procedures did not fail. Training did not fail. That belief had carried him through every inspection since arriving at Fort Ridgeline. But the sound was real now. He had heard it himself. Ellis crouched near the lower corner of the pallet carefully. Walter watched him without speaking. The younger sergeant leaned slightly closer toward the steel container, listening through the engine noise and distant radio chatter echoing across the loading zone. Tick tick tick. Ellis felt his stomach sink. I hear it, he said quietly. Mercer immediately snapped back. That does not mean anything. But the certainty was gone from his voice now. Walter's eyes stayed fixed on the crate. Pressure rhythm changed twice already. Ellis looked toward him. You can tell that? Walter nodded once. The intervals shorten when the propellant starts cooking unevenly. Mercer rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, sweat glistening beneath the harsh sunlight. There is no way you can know that from listening. Walter finally turned toward him fully. The old veteran's expression remained calm, but something ancient sat behind his eyes now. Memory. The kind built over decades men spent trying to forget things nobody else should ever see. Because I spent 3 months listening for it every night after Da Nang, Walter said softly. Silence spread again across the loading yard. Nearby soldiers stopped pretending to work entirely now. One private quietly stepped backward away from the convoy trucks without even realizing he was doing it. Ellis noticed Walter's right hand trembling faintly near his jacket pocket. Not from fear. From recognition. Like an old scar reacting to weather before a storm. The convoy clock dropped under 6 minutes. Mercer stared toward the trucks lined beside the depot. 12 soldiers were waiting inside those vehicles expecting routine orders. Men checking radios. Adjusting gloves. Drinking water beneath the climbing heat. Completely unaware that half the loading crew now stood frozen around a single crate of ammunition. Mercer grabbed his radio again and keyed the channel harder this time. Control, this is loading zone 3. I need immediate EOD verification on pallet Delta 7. Static hissed briefly before the response came back irritated. EOD team currently tied up on range 4. Earliest arrival 20 minutes. Mercer cursed under his breath. 20 minutes was impossible. The convoy would be long gone by then. Walter looked toward the pallet again. Tick tick tick. Faster. Ellis suddenly noticed something else. One of the steel bands around the crate had developed a slight warp near the lower edge. Tiny. Almost invisible beneath the heat shimmer. But once seen, impossible to ignore. Walter noticed him staring. Expansion pressure, the old veteran said quietly. Ellis felt cold despite the 90-degree heat. Mercer followed their eyes toward the warped band and his face lost color immediately. No, he muttered. That could have happened during loading. Walter slowly shook his head. Not like that. The forklift operator climbed down from his cab without being told. Another soldier near the trucks took 2 cautious steps backward. Nobody laughed anymore. The entire yard had fallen into that dangerous kind of silence soldiers only heard before something went wrong. Mercer looked between Walter and the crate, trapped between training and instinct. If this is real, he said quietly, why did none of the systems catch it? Walter's gaze drifted toward the shimmering convoy line beneath the sun. Because systems only see what they are programmed to look for. Then he looked back at the ticking crate. War teaches you to notice what everybody else misses. The entire loading yard seemed to hold its breath beneath the brutal Texas sun. No forklifts moved now. No soldiers joked. Even the diesel engines idling beside the convoy sounded distant compared to the tiny metallic rhythm echoing from inside pallet Delta 7. Tick tick tick. Faster than before. Sharper. Sergeant Noah Ellis stood frozen beside the warped steel band while Specialist Ryan Mercer stared at the crate as though seeing it for the first time. Sweat rolled down the side of Mercer's face despite the dry heat. Around the convoy line, 12 soldiers remained inside their transport trucks unaware that every second now mattered. Walter Kane listened carefully, his pale eyes narrowing. Then his expression changed. Just slightly. But enough. Ellis saw it immediately. What? He asked quietly. Walter did not answer right away. Instead, the old veteran stepped toward the forklift parked beside the pallet and placed one hand against the metal frame. The vibration from the idling engine hummed through his fingertips. Tick tick tick. The sound inside the crate responded almost instantly. Faster again. Walter's jaw tightened. Shut the forklift off, he said. The operator moved immediately this time. No hesitation. The engine died with a low rumbling fade, and sudden silence rolled across the loading yard like pressure before a storm. Everyone listened. Tick tick tick. Still there. Still accelerating. Mercer swallowed hard. How bad? Walter looked toward the warped steel band again. Bad enough. The convoy clock dropped under 5 minutes. A radio crackled somewhere near the depot entrance while hot wind carried dust across the concrete between the trucks. Walter slowly crouched beside the pallet again, leaning close enough to hear through the steel itself. Ellis noticed the old veteran's breathing slowing deliberately. Measuring. Counting. Then Walter's eyes snapped upward sharply. Nobody touches this crate, he said. His voice cut through the yard harder than any shouted command all morning. Back everybody away now. Mercer hesitated for one fatal second. Training fought instinct again inside his head. Protocol said maintain. Control. Procedure said avoid panic. But Walter no longer looked uncertain. He looked absolutely sure. Ellis reacted first. Move back, he barked toward the nearest soldiers. All personnel clear the loading lane now. Men immediately began stepping away from the pallet and convoy trucks. Boots scraped across concrete. Doors slammed. Radios crackled with confusion. One private nearly tripped backing away too quickly. Mercer still remained frozen beside the crate. You cannot know it is about to go, he said quietly. Walter's eyes locked onto his. I know because the ticking stopped. Mercer frowned. Then he realized the old man was right. Silence. Complete silence from inside the crate. Somehow that felt worse. Far worse. Walter rose instantly. Get away from it. Mercer finally stumbled backward just as a faint metallic creak echoed from deep inside the pallet. Not loud. Just enough to make every soldier nearby freeze solid. Ellis felt cold spread through his chest despite the heat. One of the steel bands suddenly gave a tiny sharp pop as tension shifted somewhere inside the crate. Then a thin ribbon of pale smoke curled upward from beneath the lower edge of the pallet. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Mercer stared at the smoke in disbelief, his face drained completely white now. Walter stepped between the crate and the convoy trucks without hesitation. Evacuate the vehicles, he ordered calmly. Ellis grabbed his radio immediately. Clear the convoy. Clear it now. Truck doors flew open across the loading line as soldiers jumped down onto the asphalt in confusion. The loading yard exploded into motion all at once. Radios screamed. Boots pounded concrete. Dust swirled beneath the hot wind. But Walter Kane never took his eyes off the smoking crate. The old veteran stood perfectly still watching the thin smoke curl upward beneath the blazing sun as though he had been standing in this exact moment his entire life. Then, far beyond the depot entrance, black SUVs suddenly appeared racing across the base toward loading zone 3. Sirens began echoing across Fort Ridgeline less than 30 seconds after Sergeant Noah Ellis ordered the convoy cleared. Soldiers rushed away from the loading lane while pale smoke continued curling from beneath pallet Delta 7 in thin twisting strands that vanished into the brutal Texas heat. The atmosphere inside the yard had transformed completely now. What started as irritation and mockery had become something colder. Controlled fear. Specialist Ryan Mercer stood several yards back from the crate, breathing hard, his eyes locked on the faint smoke rising from the warped steel bands. Around him, the loading crew moved with sharp nervous energy as trucks were abandoned and personnel pulled farther from the danger zone. But Walter Kane still stood closest to the pallet. Calm. Motionless. Watching. The distant growl of engines rolled louder across the base. Black SUVs cut through the service roads toward loading zone 3 fast enough to throw dust behind them in long sweeping clouds. Mercer noticed them first. Who the hell is that? He muttered. Ellis lowered his radio slowly, eyes narrowing toward the approaching vehicles. The lead SUV skidded to a stop near the depot entrance before the engine fully died. Doors flew open immediately. Explosive ordnance personnel in heavy protective gear spilled into the yard alongside armed base security officers. Behind them stepped a tall gray-haired man in combat fatigues carrying the unmistakable rank insignia of a brigadier general. Brigadier General Thomas Hale moved across the loading yard with the kind of speed that erased every conversation in his path. His eyes swept once across the smoking crate before locking directly onto Walter Kane. Then the general stopped cold. Completely still. The expression on his face changed instantly. Shock first. Then something deeper. Recognition. Mercer noticed it immediately and felt his stomach drop even further. General Hale stepped forward slowly now, almost disbelieving what he was seeing beneath the blazing morning sun. Walter, he said quietly. The old veteran finally turned toward him. Morning, Tom. Nobody in the yard moved. Nobody even spoke. Mercer stared between them in open confusion. Ellis felt the atmosphere tighten all over again, but differently this time. Not fear now. Reverence. General. Hale looked toward the smoking pallet again before returning his gaze to Walter. You heard it? Walter nodded once. Same pressure rhythm. Hale exhaled sharply and rubbed one hand across his mouth. Dear God. Mercer stepped forward uncertainly. Sir, with respect, who is this man? General Hale turned toward him slowly. The look in the general's eyes hit harder than any shouted reprimand could have. The reason your convoy is still alive, Hale said flatly. Silence crashed across the loading yard. Wind swept dust between the abandoned trucks while EOD technicians cautiously began establishing a perimeter around the crate. Mercer looked back toward Walter Kane, struggling to reconcile the quiet old man in the faded field jacket with the reaction standing in front of him. Hale kept speaking without taking his eyes off Walter. 46 years ago outside Da Nang, an ammunition pit started venting during monsoon season. Nobody recognized the signs in time except one specialist barely old enough to shave. Ellis watched Walter carefully. The old veteran said nothing. Hale pointed toward the pallet. 300 unstable artillery rounds buried by hand before the pressure spread to the rest of the depot. Mercer felt his chest tighten. That was him. Hale finally looked directly at him. Walter Kane rewrote modern ammunition containment doctrine after that night. The words seemed to drain the remaining color from Mercer's face. Nearby soldiers stared openly now. The same men who had laughed less than an hour ago stood silent beneath the crushing Texas sun. One EOD technician suddenly raised his voice near the crate. "Sir, thermal readings are spiking fast." Hale snapped into motion immediately. "Move everybody back another 50 yards. Personnel scattered farther across the yard while the smoke curling from beneath the pallet thickened slightly. Walter never moved. General Hale stepped beside him and lowered his voice carefully. "How much time?" Walter listened for a moment. "No ticking anymore." That was worse. Much worse. Then he answered quietly. "Not enough to gamble." The entire western side of Fort Ridgeline had fallen silent except for the wind. Dust drifted slowly across the abandoned loading yard while emergency vehicles sat parked behind the expanding security perimeter with their lights flashing against the harsh Texas sunlight. Nobody stood within 50 yards of Pallet Delta 7 anymore except the EOD containment team, Brigadier General Thomas Hale, and Walter Kane. The thin smoke rising from the crate had thickened into faint gray wisps curling steadily upward through the heat shimmer. Specialist Ryan Mercer stood farther back beside Sergeant Noah Ellis, unable to take his eyes off the old veteran. Less than an hour earlier, Mercer had laughed at him. Now every soldier in the yard watched Walter Kane the same way men watched unexploded ordnance. Carefully. Quietly. One EOD technician slowly approached the pallet carrying a portable thermal scanner while another adjusted a robotic inspection unit near the edge of the loading lane. Their movements were deliberate now. Respectful. General Hale folded his arms tightly across his chest as he stared toward the smoking crate. "Containment status," he called. The lead technician checked his monitor and answered immediately. "Internal temperatures are climbing unevenly across multiple shells. Pressure instability confirmed." A cold silence rolled through the yard. Mercer felt his stomach sink harder than before. Confirmed. Walter had been right from the beginning. The technician swallowed visibly before continuing. If this pallet had entered convoy movement, vibration and heat buildup could have triggered progressive detonation. Ellis slowly looked toward the parked transport trucks lined beside the depot. 12 soldiers would have been riding alongside those rounds through open highway heat for nearly 40 minutes. Nobody said the rest out loud. They did not need to. General Hale turned toward Walter slowly. "How did you know before the thermal spike?" Walter kept his eyes on the crate. "Pressure changes metal before it changes temperature." Hale gave a quiet disbelieving shake of his head. 46 years later and you still hear it. Walter finally looked toward him. "Some sounds never leave." Nearby soldiers lowered their eyes instinctively at the weight behind the sentence. The EOD team carefully moved the robotic inspection unit closer toward the pallet while another technician scanned the warped steel bands. One of them suddenly raised his voice. "Sir, we found vent residue near the lower casings." Hale nodded once grimly. So the propellant was already leaking. Yes, sir. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Every system had passed the shipment. Every digital inspection. Every thermal check. And still the old man in the faded field jacket had heard danger before any machine on the base. The realization hit him harder than embarrassment ever could. Walter had not guessed. He had remembered. General Hale stepped closer to Walter and, without hesitation, raised his hand in a crisp formal salute beneath the blazing Texas sun. The entire loading yard froze. Mercer stared in disbelief as the Brigadier General held the salute steady before a man wearing no rank, no ribbons, and no polished uniform. Just old scars hidden beneath faded cloth and quiet eyes that had seen too much. Walter looked at the salute for a long moment before returning it slowly. No pride. No performance. Just recognition between two men who understood exactly how close death had come to the convoy line that morning. Around them, soldiers instinctively straightened where they stood. Some removed their caps. Others simply stood silent beneath the heat and wind. Mercer felt his throat tighten as the weight of his own words from earlier replayed inside his head. Ghosts. Fortune teller. Old man. Walter lowered his hand first. You should rotate those storage procedures, he said calmly. The heat cycling in this yard is uneven afternoon. Hale almost smiled despite the tension. You still giving orders after retirement? Walter glanced once more toward the smoking crate. Only when people are about to make expensive mistakes. A few nearby soldiers let out nervous breaths that almost sounded like laughter, but nobody truly relaxed yet. The danger still sat in front of them wrapped in steel and smoke beneath the burning Texas sky. Mercer slowly stepped forward at last. The young specialist looked nothing like the confident man from earlier that morning. He stopped a few feet from Walter, struggling for words. Finally he managed quietly, Sir. I did not know. Walter looked at him for a long moment before answering. That is the problem with experience, son. The hot wind moved through the yard again, rattling loose canvas somewhere beyond the depot. Walter's pale eyes drifted toward the convoy trucks one final time. The people who survive it rarely talk about